So this is the third video of the ASP.NET Core 8 series, and in here we want to connect to our database. So I'm just going to open the SQL Server Management Studio, and in here we just want to make note of the server name. So here we can see the server name, and we just want to copy that, and then we can close this. There is also a way of checking it through this Server Object Explorer here, but we won't be using that for now. So in the app settings.json file here, this is where all our environment variables for our project live. So if you need to store some sensitive data in your project, this is where you'd store it. And we just want to add a new parameter here called connection strings, and you can see that comes up automatically here. And this will open another array thing here. So in this we want to add a default connection, or you could name this whatever you want, but I'm just going to name it default connection. And for a value here we want to add the connection string to connect to our database. So to build our connection string, we'll say server, and that's where we'll paste in the server name here. Then we add our semicolon, and the next parameter we want to give it is the database name. So we'll say database is equal to, and here we'll give a name for our database. I'll just call this ASP course. And we'll add our semicolon here. And the next parameter we want to give it is, we are using Windows authentication. So if I come back to SQL Server Management Studio, we'll see that here it's using Windows authentication type. So to make that work, we actually need to set trusted connection to true. So trusted underscore connection, and we'll set that equal to true. And this is the basic connection string we'll use to connect to a SQL database. If you're connecting to a different type of database, you may need a different connection string, so you can just Google how to set that up. Also, if you have a username or password, you can Google how to add that into the connection string. But for this connection, this should be fine. So we'll just close this. And now we want to add a few things to our project. So we want to click on dependency, and we want to right click and say manage NuGet packages. So in here we want to go to browse, and there's a few packages we need to install. So we need to install entity, and you can see here we have entity framework core. So we just want to select the latest version that works with ours. So usually, like if you have .NET Core, which is what we're using here, we have version 8. We want to install the same version of framework core, so version 8. And we want to install this. The next thing we want to install is the tools for it. So if you scroll down a bit, you'll see Entity Framework Core Tools. And the last thing we want to install is Entity SQL. So here we have Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. And that's the last thing we want to install. So what is this entity package that we're installing? Well, that's what we're going to be using to connect to our database. So in our project here, we want to create a new folder called data. And inside of that folder, we want to create a new class file called application DB context. So this context file is inside of our project. We're going to pretend that this is the actual database. So when we want to add stuff to our database, or delete stuff or update stuff, we're going to work with this file. And this is going to inherit from the default DB context class. And this class comes from Entity Framework Core. So this is how we're going to be connecting to our database. And here we just want to add a constructor, and we're going to say options here, or DB options. That's the type of this parameter, DB context options. And it's going to be of the same type as what we just created, so application DB context. And we're just going to call this parameter options, and we're going to pass that to the base DB context class. So in here we're not really going to add anything, but we are going to add a DB set down here. So to use this DB set, we first need to mention what type of objects we're going to be storing here. And the DB set is basically just a table. So we want to go into the models folder here and create our first object. So we'll create a class here, and we'll leave that as class, and we'll call this products. So here, this is just a model, so we don't actually want to put any real code in here. We just want to create the properties that the table will store. So we want to create a public int of ID, and this is the ID field that will be in our database. So by default, if we name this ID, it will automatically be a key, primary key of our database. But if we wanted to really specify that, we could say key over here. And this is a data attribute. So by writing this above our property, we're saying that this is going to be the primary key of our database. So we can also add the required tag here, and we're going to say name. So this is the name of our product, and then we're going to have a price. And I just set that to decimal. And since we have required here, that means it has to be passed in when the user creates something. So we're going to have an ID, name, and price, and the table name is going to be products. But right now I've actually named this file products, but I actually want it to be named product, so a singular name. And I'm just going to change the name of the file here. And that should be fine now. So in our DB context again, we want to now add this DB set. So we'll say public DB set, and we'll say the type is product, which is the model we just created. And we'll call it products. So before we go any further, the reason why we named that product and we named the DB set products with the S is because this model is one product. So this is what one product would look like. And this name here is actually what's going to be passed to the database. So when we create the table name is going to be this. And now we'll look at how that actually works. So there's one more thing we need to do, and that's in program.cs here. You'll see that there's some services here, and we need to add our application DB context into here so that it can get injected into all of our controllers and we have access to our database. So to do that, we want to say builder.services.add application DB. It's add DB context. And here for the type, we want to say application DB context. And then for the parameters, remember this takes our options parameter here. So we want to say options, and then we want to do some lambda expression, and we want to say options dot use SQL. So that's the SQL NuGet package that we installed, and this takes one parameter, and that's the connection string. So we'll say builder dot configuration dot get connection string, and this will fetch a connection string from the apps.json file which we edited earlier. And remember, we named that connection string default connection. So let's just open that and make sure we spelled it right. And now there's no errors here, so we should be able to run this. So to run it, you want to go to Package Manager console. And if you don't see this down here, you want to go to Views and then find it in here to enable it. And then you want to say add-migration. So this is going to add a migration file to our project. So it won't automatically update the database. It will first give us a file showing us what it's going to do. So that's what this migration file is. And we'll just call this initial. So now we can see it added a new folder here called migrations. And this is the file that it just created. So you can see it's going to create a table. And the name is going to be products, which we defined in the application DB context here. And the columns is going to be ID, which is going to be the primary key, name, which we set in the product model here, and then price. And the constraints here, we can see that it's going to be setting the primary key to ID. So if we're happy with the migration that it just created here, we're going to say update database. And don't worry about this error up here. I accidentally typed database update before. The correct command is update database. So if everything worked correctly, we should see that it was added to the database with these columns and names. But here we get an error saying the certificate was not trusted. So we need to edit the connection string here and set trust certificate equal to true. So if you get this error, you also need to add trust server certificate equal to true here. And now if you run this, it should work correctly. So it says done. And if we open the SQL Server Management Studio and we connect, we should see that now in our database, under databases, we should see ASP course, which is the one we just created. And then we should see tables here. And now we have a products table, which is what we just created. So if we right click and click on select top 1000 or something, we should see that now it has the correct fields which we set in the products model. So it has the ID field, the name field, and the price field. So with this, we have our database set up correctly. And in the next video, we'll start working on our pages and stuff.